Her fingers were small and shaking as they clutched the edge of his coat. Not pulling hard, just enough to be noticed. "Please," the girl said, her voice cracking under the weight of fear. "They're hurting my brother." The words landed wrong in the room. Conversations stopped mid-breath. A fork froze halfway to a mouth. The low hum of confidence and money died instantly, replaced by something colder, attention. The man she had reached for did not turn right away. Because the man was Marco DeLuca. People didn't touch Marco DeLuca. They didn't interrupt him. They didn't speak to him unless spoken to. In this city, his name wasn't whispered, it was avoided. Power didn't need to announce itself here. It sat quietly, dressed well, and expected obedience. And yet, a child had crossed the distance no one else dared to. Marco finally looked down. The girl couldn't have been more than 6. Her hair was tangled, her shoes mismatched, one sock soaked dark at the heel. There was blood on her hands, too much for a child, not enough to belong to her. Her eyes were wide, unfiltered, fixed on him with a kind of certainty that didn't come from courage, but from desperation. "They won't stop," she said. "He told them to leave me alone." They didn't. The room held its breath. This was the moment when men usually disappeared. When mistakes were corrected quietly and permanently. Marco's guards shifted, instinct sharpening. No one in the restaurant doubted how this would end. But Marco didn't wave her away. He didn't speak. He studied her instead, really looked at her, and felt something surface that had no business being there. Recognition. Not of her face. Of her fear. Once, a long time ago, someone had looked at him like that. Someone smaller. Someone who trusted him completely. Someone he had promised to protect, and failed. The girl's grip tightened, as if she sensed the danger of being ignored. "My brother's name is Daniel," she whispered. "He said I should run." A muscle jumped in Marco's jaw. The restaurant itself seemed to recoil, as if the rules that governed this place had cracked. Marco DeLuca did not involve himself in street problems. He did not rescue people. Mercy was inefficient. Attachment was fatal. That had been the rule. For years. Slowly, deliberately, Marco pushed his chair back. The sound scraped across marble, sharp enough to cut through the silence. Every eye tracked him now. He lowered himself until he was level with her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sophia." The way she said it, soft, certain, hit harder than the plea. Outside, somewhere in the city, time was running out for a man who had spent his life standing between danger and this child. And in a room built on fear and control, a single choice was about to rewrite everything Marco DeLuca believed about power. Marco DeLuca ruled his world without raising his voice. He didn't need to. In this city, power wasn't loud. It didn't shout or threaten. It settled into rooms and waited for everyone else to adjust around it. Marco had learned that lesson early. Fear worked best when it was calm, when it was predictable, when it never had to explain itself. Men stood when he entered. Not out of courtesy, out of instinct. Chairs shifted quietly. Conversations lowered themselves without being asked. Even the ones who thought they were important felt it in their chests. That subtle tightening that came from knowing one wrong move could end everything they'd built. Marco noticed all of it. He always did. His eyes missed nothing. The slight tremor in a man's hand when numbers didn't add up. The pause before someone answered a simple question. The way loyalty showed itself not in words, but in silence. He didn't interrupt. He let people reveal themselves. That was how he stayed alive. At 38, Marco DeLuca sat at the center of an empire carved from discipline and consequence. He controlled routes, debts, favors, and secrets that stretched far beyond the city limits. Police chiefs returned his calls. Judges avoided his gaze. Men who had once challenged him no longer had names anyone remembered. Not because Marco was cruel for pleasure. 'Cause he was exact. Mistakes were corrected. Threats were removed. Chaos was bad for business, and Marco despised chaos. Emotion led to chaos. Attachment led to hesitation. Hesitation got people buried. So Marco kept his world clean. No family. No friends. No unnecessary ties. The past stayed buried where it belonged, sealed behind routines that never changed. Tuesday nights. The same restaurant. The same seat. The same controlled rhythm that proved nothing could reach him anymore. That was the rule. Nothing touched Marco DeLuca. Not grief. Not guilt. Not regret. If something ever tried, it didn't last. He remembered the man he used to be only in fragments. A younger version who believed loyalty could protect the people you loved. A fool who thought choosing ambition over family was temporary. That man had learned his lesson the hard way. And Marco had buried him alongside the weakness that came with hope. What remained was efficient, necessary, untouchable. That was the version the city knew. And in that world, his world, children didn't run into guarded rooms. They didn't grab coats worth more than their entire lives. They didn't look up at men like Marco DeLuca and expect help. That kind of belief didn't survive here. Until tonight. Until a small hand closed around his coat and refused to let go. And for the first time in years, the man no one touched felt something reach him anyway. Sofia Reyes had no idea she was breaking rules. If she had, she would have broken them anyway. She stood frozen where she'd stopped, her fingers still knotted in the heavy fabric of Marco DeLuca's coat, as if letting go might make everything she'd done disappear. The room felt too big, too quiet. Grown men stared at her like she didn't belong in the same world they did. And maybe she didn't. Her chest burned with every breath. Running had done that. So had fear. "They locked the door," she said again, quieter this time, the words tumbling out unevenly. "He told me to hide, but I couldn't. He said I had to find someone. Someone who could make them stop." Her eyes flicked around the room, searching for anger, for punishment, for the moment when someone would grab her and drag her away. That was how things usually worked. You did something wrong and it ended badly. But no one moved. The men nearest her looked uncertain, like the ground beneath them had shifted. The guards didn't reach for her. They watched Marco instead, waiting for the signal that always came. Sofia didn't know his name. She didn't know what he was capable of. She only knew what she'd seen when she burst through the door. How the room had bent around him, how everyone else seemed smaller in his presence. That had been enough. "My brother didn't do anything," she rushed on, afraid silence meant she was running out of time. "He just works nights. He walks me home from school. He said he'd fix it. He always fixes things." Her voice wavered, but she didn't cry. Crying never helped. Sofia had learned that early. "They were mad because he wouldn't give them the money yet," she said. "He said to wait. They didn't wait." She swallowed hard, her grip tightening again, not out of defiance, but because her hands were shaking too badly to stop themselves. "I don't know the rules," she admitted, looking up at Marco now, meeting his eyes for the first time. "But they're going to hurt him more if I don't hurry." There it was. The simple truth. No bargaining. No understanding of danger. Just urgency and trust placed in the wrong man, or the only one left. Someone shifted behind her. A chair scraped softly. Sofia flinched, shoulders rising, ready for the punishment she expected. It didn't come. Marco remained still. His gaze locked on her face as if the rest of the room had vanished. The fear he saw there wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was the quiet kind, the kind that came from knowing exactly how bad things could get. Sofia didn't know she'd crossed a line no one crossed. She only knew her brother was still somewhere out there. And she wasn't letting go. Marco didn't answer her right away. The room waited, but Marco wasn't there anymore. Her eyes, wide, stubborn, too steady for someone so small, had pulled him somewhere he hadn't visited in years. Somewhere he'd sealed off on purpose. Somewhere he survived by never opening again. He saw a different hallway. Narrow. Poorly lit. The smell of damp concrete and old smoke clinging to the walls. He heard shouting behind a door that shouldn't have been closed. He remembered standing on the other side of it, fists clenched, jaw tight, telling himself he had time. That he'd fix it later. Later had come too late. His brother had always been the reckless one. Too loud, too kind, always stepping in front of things he couldn't control. Marco had warned him, more than once, that the city didn't forgive that kind of courage. That protection without power was just another way to die. But his brother had smiled, clapped him on the shoulder, and said someone had to stand between the bad things and the people who didn't know how to fight back yet. Marco had chosen work that night. Meeting. A deal that couldn't wait. By the time he arrived, the alley was empty except for blood darkening the pavement and a single shoe lying on its side, as if it had been dropped mid-step. The police had called it a robbery gone wrong. Marco had known better. He had known exactly who was responsible. What he hadn't known was how heavy regret could be when it had nowhere to go. He'd buried his brother quickly. Buried the grief faster. Built something cold and unmovable on top of it. An empire that didn't hesitate. A reputation that made sure no one ever mistook mercy for weakness again. That was the price of failure. Now, standing in front of him, was a child who had been told to run. A child whose brother had stayed behind. Marco felt his chest tighten, the sensation unfamiliar and unwelcome. He had trained himself not to feel this. To see patterns, not people. Risks, not faces. But Sophia's fingers were still wrapped in his coat. She hadn't loosened her grip. She hadn't looked away. He realized, distantly, that his hand had curled into a fist at his side. The room came back into focus slowly. The lights, men, the waiting. Marco exhaled through his nose. History had a way of repeating itself when you ignored it long enough. He looked down at Sophia again, not as a problem to be removed, not as an interruption, but as a warning he'd already lived once. And this time, he knew exactly what would happen if he turned away. Marco DeLuca had learned the cost of feeling early. It wasn't taught gently. The night after his brother died, Marco didn't cry. He didn't scream or break anything. He stood in the quiet of his apartment long after the sun came up, staring at a wall that suddenly felt too close. The city outside kept moving. Cars passed. People laughed somewhere below. Life went on, indifferent to the fact that something essential had been ripped out of him. That was when he understood the truth no one ever said out loud. Love didn't protect you. It exposed you. At the funeral, men clasped his shoulder and spoke in low voices about revenge and justice, about what had to be done next. Marco listened, nodded, absorbed it all. But when he looked down at the coffin, all he could think was that his brother had trusted him. Trusted that Marco's reach was long enough. Trusted that power meant safety. It hadn't. That was the moment Marco made his vow. Not out loud, not to God or family, but to himself. He would never hesitate again. He would never allow attachment to blur judgment. No one would ever have the power to hurt him by being taken away. Emotion was a liability. Care was a weakness. And weakness got people killed. From that day on, Marco dismantled anything in his life that could make him pause. Friends drifted away. Family became a word, not a presence. His days filled with structure and precision. His nights with planning and control. He replaced grief with discipline, guilt with results. The city rewarded him for it. He rose faster than anyone expected. Problems disappeared. Enemies reconsidered. People learned that Marco DeLuca didn't act out of anger or mercy, only necessity. That reputation became armor, thick enough that nothing could reach what he'd buried underneath. Or so he believed. Standing there now, with Sofia Reyes still gripping his coat like it was the only solid thing left in her world, Marco felt the old vow stir. Tight, sharp, defensive. This was exactly how it started. The voice in his head warned. This was how you lose control. You step in, you care, and the city reminds you why you shouldn't. He had lived 10 years by that rule. 10 years without letting himself imagine different endings. But the vow he'd made had been forged in blood and regret, not wisdom. It had kept him powerful but hollow, safe but alone. Sophia looked up at him again, waiting. Marco realized something then that unsettled him more than fear ever had. He wasn't remembering his brother because the past was reaching out. He was remembering him because the present was asking the same question. And this time, Marco DeLuca wasn't sure he could answer it the same way. Daniel Reyes learned early how to stand in front of things. Started small. Holding doors open when voices rose inside their apartment. Walking a little closer to the street side of the sidewalk. Letting other kids go first when someone older looked angry. He didn't think of it as bravery. It was just instinct. The quiet understanding that if something bad was coming, it should hit him before it hit Sophia. He was 10 when their father disappeared. 12 when their mother stopped coming home at all. By 14, Daniel knew how to cook cheap meals, stretch a paycheck that wasn't there yet, and lie convincingly to teachers about why Sophia was always tired. He learned which bills could wait and which ones couldn't. He learned to smile when he was scared, to say everything was fine even when it wasn't. Most of all, he learned to say no to himself. Daniel worked nights because nights paid better. He walked Sophia to school every morning because mornings were dangerous. He told her stories about how things would be different one day, about houses with real kitchens and locks that worked, about a future where she wouldn't have to count steps between streetlights. He never told her how heavy those promises felt. When the wrong people noticed him, Daniel tried to handle it quietly. A loan to cover rent. Another to keep the heat on. A third when Sophia got sick and he missed too many shifts. The numbers grew faster than he could outrun them. Still, he didn't let them near her. When the threats started, Daniel walked Sophia home earlier. When the warnings came, he changed routes. When the men finally showed up at their door, he stepped outside and closed it behind him. "Don't come out," he told her. "No matter what you hear." He said it calmly, like it was just another rule. They hit him because he wouldn't give up her name. They hit him because fear was their language and he refused to speak it. When they shoved him against the wall, when blood filled his mouth and his knees buckled, Daniel thought only of time. Of buying enough of it. When Sophia ran, he didn't stop her. That was the plan. He had always known how this might end. He had accepted it long before the bruises formed, long before the debt became a sentence. If being a shield meant breaking, then breaking was worth it, as long as she stayed whole. Somewhere in the city, a little girl was holding on to a man who ruled through fear, believing with everything she had that power could still be used to protect. Daniel Reyes didn't know that yet. He only knew he'd done what he always did. He stood in front. The men Daniel owed didn't think of themselves as cruel. They thought of themselves as practical. Debt, to them, was a language everyone understood eventually. You missed a payment, they reminded you. You missed another, they adjusted the reminder. Pain wasn't personal, it was instructional. Taught priorities. Taught obedience. Daniel had learned the lesson too well. The warehouse sat at the edge of a forgotten block, its windows boarded, its doors scarred by years of use that never led to anything honest. The men who worked there didn't rush. They never had to. Fear did the running for them. They tied Daniel to a chair not because they needed to, but because it made a point. Each knot was deliberate. Each pause between words calculated. "You keep saying tomorrow," one of them said calmly, circling him. "Tomorrow doesn't pay interest." Daniel lifted his head, blood drying at the corner of his mouth. "I told you," he said. "I'll work it off. I just need." A fist landed, hard enough to steal the rest of the sentence. The chair rocked but didn't fall. "That's not how this works," another voice said. "You don't get to decide the terms." They weren't angry. That was the worst part. Anger burned hot and fast. This was cold, efficient. The kind of violence that didn't stop unless someone stopped it. They talked about Sophia like she was an idea. Possibility. Something that could be used if Daniel continued to misunderstand his position. Daniel's breathing turned shallow. Not from pain, from fear. Not for himself. For the door he'd closed behind him. For the promise he'd made. Outside, night pressed in thick and heavy, indifferent to what happened inside forgotten buildings. Time moved forward without mercy. Minutes passed. And more. The men checked their watches. "We'll give you one more chance," the first one said. "You tell us where she is, and this ends quicker." Daniel shook his head. "Once. Final." That was when they decided he was no longer useful. Across the city, Marco DeLuca stood in a room where power waited for his word. Phones sat idle. Engines were quiet for now. Sophia's grip hadn't loosened. If anything, it had tightened, as if she felt the clock winding down. Marco understood that feeling. Because debt wasn't just money. Debt was leverage. It was pressure applied until something gave. And if nothing intervened soon, Daniel Reyes was going to give in the only way left. By breaking. And somewhere between the warehouse and the restaurant, the line between mercy and necessity was about to disappear entirely. Time stopped feeling abstract the moment Marco glanced at his watch. It wasn't the number that mattered. It was the certainty behind it. He knew how long men like this took before they escalated. He knew the rhythm of fear, the way patience thinned, the way cruelty sharpened when boredom set in. He had built an empire on understanding exactly how long suffering could be stretched before it snapped. Sophia shifted closer to him, as if drawn by something she couldn't name. Her head barely reached his chest. He was suddenly aware of how small she was. How easily she could disappear in a city that didn't slow down for anyone. "They said he wouldn't last," she whispered, the words barely audible. One of them laughed. That did it. Marco's jaw tightened, not in anger but in focus. Anger clouded judgment. Focus cleared it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, the movement unhurried but decisive. Around him, men straightened, sensing the shift. They didn't need explanations. They had seen this look before. Right before situations stopped being reversible. "Find him," Marco said quietly. No raised voice. No wasted words. "Now." Orders rippled outward instantly. Phones lit up. Chairs moved. Somewhere in the city, engines turned over, metal answering metal. Marco didn't wait for confirmation. He never did. Waiting was a luxury for people who believed time was on their side. He crouched slightly, lowering himself again to Sophia's level. "Listen to me," he said. "I need you to remember exactly what your brother told you. Every detail." She nodded quickly, eyes shining but steady. She spoke in fragments. Street names, a broken light, the sound of trucks nearby. Marco absorbed it all, mapping routes in his head, narrowing possibilities with ruthless efficiency. Each second felt heavier than the last. Across the city, Daniel's breathing had slowed to something shallow and uneven. The chair creaked under his weight as he slumped forward, strength bleeding out with every passing minute. The men around him checked their watches again. They were done waiting. "Finish it," one of them said. A hand reached for something solid. At the same moment, Marco straightened, slipping his jacket from Sophia's grasp only long enough to wrap it fully around her shoulders. It swallowed her whole, but she didn't protest. She clutched it like armor. "No one touches her," Marco said to the room. It wasn't a request. He stepped forward, already moving, already committed. Because the clock had run out. And this time, Marco DeLuca refused to arrive too late. The warehouse didn't hear them coming. That was intentional. Marco's convoy cut its engines a block away, metal cooling in the dark as men moved without speaking. No headlights, no sirens. Just the quiet certainty of people who knew exactly where they were and why they'd come. Inside, the men around Daniel were growing impatient. One of them reached for his collar, lifting his head just enough to look into his eyes. "You had your chance," he said. The door didn't explode. It didn't crash open. It unlocked. The first sound was confusion. The second was fear. Marco stepped inside last. The room smelled of oil, old dust, and blood that hadn't been cleaned yet. He took it in at a glance. The chair, the ropes, the men positioned like they owned the place. His gaze landed on Daniel, slumped but breathing, and something tight in his chest loosened just enough to let him think clearly. The men turned. Recognition spread fast. Fast enough to steal the air from the room. "DeLuca," one of them said, voice faltering. "This isn't." "It is," Marco replied calmly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His men had already fanned out, already taken control of exits and angles. Power didn't announce itself. It settled in and waited for resistance to die on its own. "You took a debt that wasn't yours to collect," Marco continued, stepping closer. "You broke rules you don't understand." The leader swallowed. "He owes." Marco cut him off with a look. "No," he said. "You do." Silence followed. Heavy. Final. Marco crouched beside Daniel, checking his pulse, loosening the ropes with practiced efficiency. Daniel stirred, pain flashing briefly across his face before fading into exhaustion. Marco placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You did good," he said quietly. "It's over." Behind him, the men responsible were already being disarmed, already realizing there would be no negotiation. Marco didn't linger on them. Consequences would come. They always did. Outside, Sophia waited in the car, clutching Marco's jacket with both hands. When she saw Daniel being carried out, her breath caught, not in fear this time, but relief so sharp it hurt. Marco watched her through the open door as she ran to her brother's side, tears finally spilling free. That was when he understood. This wasn't about territory or debt or sending a message. This was about standing where he once hadn't. Marco turned back toward the warehouse, his face settling into something cold and resolved. Power had moved tonight. Not for control, for protection. And the city would feel the difference by morning. By the time dawn brushed the edges of the city, the noise had faded. Sirens were distant, engines quiet. The kind of quiet that followed decisions that couldn't be undone. Daniel lay in a hospital bed, bruised and stitched, breathing steadily beneath thin white sheets. Machines hummed softly around him, indifferent witnesses to survival. Sophia sat curled in a chair beside him, still wrapped in Marco's jacket, her head resting against the mattress as if she were afraid to let go even now. Marco stood near the door, arms folded, watching. This was the part no one ever saw. He was used to aftermaths measured in territory gained or threats removed. Used to walking away once the message was sent. But this waiting, this stillness, felt heavier than any confrontation. Mercy always did. It lingered. It asked questions power never had to answer. Sophia stirred and looked up at him, eyes red but steady. "He's going to wake up," she said. Not asking, stating it. Marco nodded. "Yes." She considered him for a moment, then whispered, "Thank you." 2 words. No fear in them. No debt implied. They hit harder than anything that night. Marco left before visiting hours began. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. Outside, his men waited, faces carefully neutral, but he could feel the shift among them. News would spread. It always did. Marco DeLuca had intervened. Not for business. Not for power. For a child. Some would see it as weakness. Crack in the armor. An opportunity. They would be wrong. Mercy had a cost, but so did cruelty. Marco understood now that the difference was choice. He had chosen fear for a decade because it was easy. Because it kept him safe. Because it kept the past buried. Tonight he had chosen something harder. By morning, the syndicate that touched Daniel Reyes would be dismantled quietly. Counts frozen. Routes closed. Leaders replaced by absence. Marco didn't announce these things. He never had. Consequences spoke for themselves. Weeks later, Sophia would return to school with new shoes and a lighter step. Daniel would walk beside her again, slower, healing but alive. They would move to a different part of the city, one with working locks and sunlight through real windows. They would never see Marco DeLuca again. That was the point. For Marco, the city would continue to fear him. Needed to. Order demanded it. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. The vow he'd made in blood hadn't shattered. It had been rewritten. He would still be exact, still be dangerous, but never again indifferent. Because once, in a room built on fear, a little girl had grabbed his coat and reminded him that power meant nothing if it didn't protect someone smaller. And that was the price mercy demanded of a monster. To remember why he became one, and choose just once to be something else.